Okay, I guess we can get started. I don't see, I'm not sure if anybody here is new, if you haven't been here before. If you haven't and you'd like to introduce yourself, feel free to raise your hand digitally or physically. Liren, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Liran. I've started to contribute a little bit late recently, and I've adopted OpenFeature in my company. OpenFeature. Yeah. Hi, I'm a software developer.
Awesome. Yeah, welcome. Nice to meet you.
Thanks.
Yeah, very cool. It's been cool to have you around. Appreciate your reviews, especially your Java reviews have been really helpful lately.
Thanks.
Um, and your contributions. Yeah, always appreciated. Okay, I guess we can just get started. So yeah, this next point's pretty quick. I opened a possible a proposal to discuss potentially a 070 spec release. The changes are very small. If you go to that issue, you'll see that the diff. Um, the only thing I'd like to also have in here is Thomas's uh weight PR. Actually, that might be merged already. I can't remember.
It's
If it's
merged.
not, it gets merged. So we have that too. So there's one, yeah, sorry, there's one other remaining thing. It's not Thomas's await PR, but it's the changes to do with events around context changes in the client, which I think is a good idea. So that's open as a PR. I'd like to get that in as well. But anyway, the net changes are fairly small. We have one more provider state, a couple of small changes. So it's nothing like the 060 release. Basically, I POC'd it in the JavaScript SDK. It's pretty small. Just takes a few minutes to implement. But I would like to get that out there at some point. Hopefully when we get that next spec PR merged, take a look at that if you're interested. It only impacts the client, but kind of important. The other thing I wanted to talk about today is the React SDK. So yeah, I have a link there to that proposal. Right now I opened it in the JS SDK contribs because I knew that would be a fairly easy place to implement it. I think we can also implement it in the JS SDK as a new package. So I could move the whole issue if people feel like that's a better place for it. I think it's possible it will be slightly more difficult to implement there, but I'm not sure. So the last thing I was going to say on that topic is if people are interested, I can actually try creating like a stub experimental package either in the JS SDK or the contrib so that then we can actually play around with releasing a 010 experimental version, and we can keep releasing it if we want. We can experiment with it, play with it. It'll be released with a dash experimental like we were for the web SDK for a long time, so people can expect breaking changes, and we can just try things out if we want. Be very explicit about the fact that it's experimental. So if that's appealing to people, if people would like that and they don't want to do the whole boilerplate with NX or setting up the monorepo, I'm happy to do that. That's really all I wanted to propose.
All right, nice. Yeah, once again, if you have anything to add, please feel free to do it. Looks like I'm next, but I don't have a ton on here, so I'll rip through it quite quickly. Um, One, I'm in the process of working on an OFAP for provider metadata. We already have provider metadata, but it's only supports provider name at the moment. That's explicitly stated in the spec. I'd like to propose that the provider can have like a mutable provider metadata capabilities, I suppose. And the idea is like maybe during initialization, it could set things like project environment, possibly like management URL or whatever the case may be that's consistent across all flag evaluations. It's important to be on the provider metadata though, as opposed to flag metadata, because of flag metadata, if the flag evaluation fails, like you don't get that in an after hook, for example, which means that you don't have that for like a telemetry hook, for example. So there's a couple reasons for it. I'm trying to outline all of the kind of advantages. I think there's value to both because you still may need to have flag specific metadata. But there's definitely, I think, a case for more, provider specific metadata as well. So look for that. I'm like 80% through writing the proposal, but I just need to kind of finish it up before I open it up.
Mike, I have a question about that. Sorry. So
Yep.
do you mean the provider is it the provider sending its metadata to the OpenFeature SDK, or am I
It
thinking
would
of it the
set
wrong way
it
around?
in the provider itself is the way I would see it. So like from the outside, like it'd be mutable by the provider itself. So like during like initialization, it could maybe pull it from the management system and then set it. And then it would be basically read only by consumers and hooks would be the idea. And that way, like, for example, if we did like an open telemetry hook as like a span attribute, we could set like, this was the environment ID where this flag came from. Because right now we have flag key, which works okay, but in almost every system, you can have multiple environments, which means there's different like variations of the same flag. And that becomes particularly challenging in like an error hook. So if someone tries to evaluate a flag that doesn't exist, we get no metadata at all, based on like our design patterns. So that's kind of the idea there. It's basically a slight extension of Pete's original like flag metadata proposal.
So one thing that Flagsmith's going to be working on, and this has come up a few times, is something going sort of in the other direction. So when you initialize, well, thinking outside without OpenFeature just for now, when people initialize our SDK, they want to be able to provide information about like, I don't know what microservice that is running the Flagsmith SDK that's making those flag evaluations, or the version of that platform or something that then gets sent back to Flagsmith so they can see like which service is doing more evaluations of a particular flag or something like that. So maybe that sounds like a completely separate.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be like evaluation context? Like you could set like some of that more general stuff like globally. And then also that could be, that's already captured and could be tracked.
It's almost like you'd only want to set it once on initialization, and then it can't be changed, kind of thing.
I mean, you can, yeah, the global context, you could do it. You could mutate it technically, but
right.
But
Well,
I mean,
there's a slight difference in intent, I think. Like maybe I'm not sure if I understand Ben's use case entirely. Like I might need to know more, but like evaluation context is specifically to be used as input to evaluation, right? So if that's not the category of information you're talking about, if there's just some other kind of metadata you want to involve and it's not a factor in evaluations, the context might not be the right place for it, and we might want some kind of other bag of data like the kind you're talking about to pass. Yeah, so I don't know. I could see it, and then I think in that case I think it is kind of related. But I think we need to think about it more, and I'd like to understand the use case a little bit more.
So basically, like for customers of ours, let's say they have like 5 microservice teams all using the same Flagsmith project, so they have shared flags. They want to be able to, when they initialize the Flagsmith SDK, announce which application it is that's doing the initialization, so that when we capture things like flag evaluation analytics, we're capturing what microservice it is that's generated that evaluation event. Or like, and it would probably be like a dictionary or something that you could provide like a version number or something like that as well. Or like we have customers that have like an iOS and Android application that have a shared project, but they want to know, so it's basically in our use case, it's primarily for analytics data. But I think it would be useful for like if you're hooked up to OpenTelemetry and you've got 5 microservices and they're all using the same environment key, then you've got no idea. There's no way of telling those apart potentially, right?
I mean, in that example, you could also include that, the version number or the service name or whatever separately in the traces,
Yeah.
in the baggage or whatever. I still think you would, although I get what you're saying, Todd, that like the kind of the maybe the reason for including the information is different. Like it's not for flag evaluation. I still think you could just put it in the context, and because there'd probably be I would imagine there'd be a lot of cases where you do end up wanting to use it for flag evaluation, and from the kind of the consumer's perspective, they're like, I don't know, like my boss told me, or like the platform team told me I needed to include this information in the context, so I'm going to stuff it in there, and I'm not really sure why.
It's tricky, like I get, whether you want an actual like rigid thing of like this is the application name or something, rather than then going, right, oh, if you want to track the application name in the Flagsmith Flag Analytics engine, you need to send a context with a key of _ Flagsmith name. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
You would like, if you I think in that context, you would probably end up providing a little like wrapper on top of the SDK. Like with OpenTelemetry, like different providers have like, I think this is what they call distros or something like that, where like if I was Dynatrace, I wouldn't just say like, in my documentation, here's the 55 different OpenTelemetry packages you need to install, and here's how you wire them together. There's like a little thing that sits on top that says like, we'll do all the wiring up for you. You could do something similar with like OpenTelemetry and Flagsmith, where you have a little Flagsmith OpenTelemetry thing, and you call it with like the service name and the version and all the rest of it, and under the covers it ends up wiring the things up. But
we literally we're building exactly that, what you describe internally, just so that the configuration is done basically for all the teams that want to use it. So I think that you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'll open up that pull request hopefully in a little bit. Pretty far along. And then if Ben, if you want to add any comments and see if it makes sense to include here or potentially elsewhere. I mean, I think there's a couple ways we could handle your scenario, but I'd like to kind of think through it a bit more. And if you can kind of define the exact kind of data flow and use cases, I think that would help quite a bit too.
Yeah, sure. I think some of the other larger providers offer something like that as well. So maybe there's a kind of common denominator emerging around that. I'm not sure. We haven't built it yet, so we need to kind of research it anyway. So
okay,
can do that.
Yeah, happy to take a look. It's probably a separate OFEP then, and we can kind of look through it. But take a look at my proposal.
I think it would be, yeah.
Cool. All right, the next one I have is SDK README improvements. So I spent some time basically looking at a lot of our READMEs for SDKs. I kind of feel like it's easier for contributors to update the README in the SDK repo as opposed to going to a separate doc place and updating it. And so there's a new template. We've updated the JavaScript SDKs both for Node and for web with the new README. Java's been updated and Go has been updated. And basically now in the docs, there's a little script that like sucks them in from the different repos and then displays it in the docs in a fairly nice looking way. We still need to do it in a few other SDKs. So there are some probably open items there. If anyone is feels like taking a crack at updating the SDK or the READMEs, please feel free to do that. Todd did update the general template in the org yesterday. So yeah, you can see an example. Todd posted it in the chat. But then we can basically, if we have this nice template, we can start using it to potentially build like a support matrix and all that type of stuff in our docs in a fairly easy and consistent way. So I think it's looking pretty decent, but definitely, any feedback that you have, let me know. Happy to make some tweaks. We're still kind of working through it. Cool. And then the last one is I started an implementation of basically, and I don't have a good term for it yet, but I'm calling it like runtime category detection. This almost exclusively at this point affects the JavaScript SDKs because we have Node and Web, and there's just subtle differences between the two. And so I have a pull request open right now. It's in a draft state right now, but it basically like if the provider explicitly sets like its category or intent, and it doesn't match the SDK, it will throw during basically registration. But I'd kind of like to get some other eyes on that. Even though it's in a draft state right now, it's like, do we like the terminology? Is it okay to throw? I think it's okay because it's during initial registration. We've talked about that a couple times, but it is, I think, the first time that we would be throwing during any kind of, system behavior. So yeah, if I can, I'll link it in the chat here, but that's kind of an open question right now. That's why I have it in a draft state. It's like it all works. It's just, do we want do we want this to behave in this way? And so feedback and even some of the terminology that we use, I'd like to kind of think through that a bit. So
What did we, Todd, do you remember when we were talking about like originally doing like the client side versus server side, there was like did we call it like paradigm or like, there was some word we used.
that was
Yeah,
the
we started
spec
with
terminology.
Yeah, we still use paradigm in the spec, but that's because it's like it's actually a slightly different API, right? So we have different availability of the context. But in our glossary, you can see like we actually still mention paradigm, but we say generally we also just generally, since it's generally true that one paradigm works on the client and one works on the server, we generally say client and server just because it makes things simpler for people.
Right.
But
If you were
yeah,
gonna say like, if you were going to ask someone, is it, are you using it on the client or the server? Would we say, which paradigm are you using it on, the client or the server? Is that the right word?
I think
But
we more
that's
use
my
it to describe
challenge.
the API. Yeah, I think this is like it's tough because I don't know that there's a super great term for it. Like when I think of client versus server, I think of different hosts, but saying host doesn't make sense. When I think of you could also say runtime, but then you're mixing in like, well, do you mean like Java? Because Java's a
Yeah.
runtime. Like
Right.
it,
Yeah, I think I had a conversation with Mike about that. Like, is it Node? Because it's like the Node.
Yeah, and I did switch that,
we
by the
work for
way,
Dena.
which I think
Yeah.
that's a good change, but still it's like server versus client. I think people understand that, but what is that? Like what like I put it under a category, I think, so far, but like it's a weird thing that should be easy. I actually don't know. Maybe you should ask your consulting buddies, Pete, and see if there's a if you can coin a new term for it or something, but it's
I just come up with like a brand new word. I just listened to a really good conference talk about generative AI, and apparently one of the best things to use ChatGPT for is naming things. So I tried that and it was terrible, absolutely awful. So I don't recommend using ChatGPT for this.
maybe it's just a bad prompt.
You heard it here, folks.
That was like a Jedi mind trick. Now everyone is going to use ChatGPT to come up with
Pete is bearish on chatbots. You heard it here first.
I wouldn't. Yeah.
Can it do cache invalidation or not?
Yeah.
Yeah, and divide by
Probably
zero
not.
and all that stuff.
Probably not. Yeah.
Do everything. Yeah, it looks like that's it for my topic. It looks like Wired added some stuff too. So
Yeah, let's go ahead and move on then. Vire, did you want to say anything about this tracking analytics stuff? We can't hear you if you're talking. I'm not sure. It might be a audio issue, mic issue. Okay. It looks like we have some audio issues potentially from Vire, but I know that he's worked on this stuff in the past, and I think there is an issue open. Something to definitely think about. I don't want to take up his time, but I think the idea is like basically tracking our goal events. So you could say like once the user has reached a certain point, we want to fire some kind of event to indicate that, which is a feature that exists in a few SDKs that I'm aware of, not all of them though.
So would this just be like just enough of like an API that someone could, in theory, do the kind of like close the loop on analytics and say like, you know, I don't know, if you're doing like an A/B test on the color of the button, then it would just be just enough API that you could fire an event to say they clicked the button, and then you would know whether the blue button performed better than the red button.
Yeah, that's what Wyatt was saying, and I think that would make sense. Like the only thing I wouldn't want to do is I don't want to compete with Segment or something, you know, or any of these other like event tracking tools. Like I think it would only make sense in the context of like a flag evaluation. And if we like added in like flag metadata or something like that is kind of my initial thoughts here. I think other than that, it's like then we're really trending into like, you know, user analytics and stuff
Yeah.
like that, which may be interesting, but that's a pretty big departure from what we've been working on. But I do think there could be value in like if you wanted to do flag tracking, and even if it's a tool that doesn't support it, if you could register like segment or whatever behind the scenes, and it's like, you know, I do flag details, and possibly on that there's like a track event or whatever, and that can, you know, encapsulates like the, you know, some of the stuff I was talking about, that maybe the provider metadata and the flag ID and all that stuff automatically. And then those tools could like do the association.
I mean, the thing that I can very much expect there to be a need for is to do the correlation, right? Of saying this flag was seen and this thing happened, right? And if you didn't, I think you need there needs to be some connective tissue between the two, because otherwise, I think there's probably going to be a lot of systems where if there isn't just a little bit of like thing to connect the two, then it would be hard to do like an accurate kind of like assessment of like, you know, did this user like press this button, this user exhibited this behavior, did they see the flag or didn't they, right? Like I have a feeling that a lot of systems, like if you were building an A/B testing platform, if you had an A/B testing platform and you wanted to use the OpenFeature SDK for the decision part, then you'd want to be able to connect the two together. I can totally believe that that's something that is going to be really, really important. The thing that I personally I'm nervous about is OpenFeature trying to implement a full-on like analytics, like the full API for doing for doing experimentation. And I wonder whether there's a way that we can kind of like solve that by just doing the connective tissue part, like having some kind of like exposing some context that then the other thing can some other library can consume, some other SDK can consume, versus like trying to be that SDK.
Yeah, I mean, the other thought is I know OpenTelemetry is working on just like a generic like event API. I think it's actually quite far along because it's similar to logs. It's just got a little bit more structure. Like maybe that's a thing that we could, you know, leverage potentially. I think in Viard's case, he's like he's using Posthog, and Posthog does the two like very closely together, and it's kind of a bummer to say use the OpenFeature SDK for feature flags and then use this other SDK to do the tracking. So like how could they maybe live together? But sorry, go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say Wired is seeming to have some mic issues, but when Pete was initially describing his proposal, describing his understanding of the proposal, it seems like Wired basically was agreeing with it. So yeah, some kind of minimal API to do tracking. I think it makes sense. I think we want to make it fully pluggable, and I don't know what that would look like. But I think it would be like you'd be able to register maybe the same provider as both your flag provider and a track provider, or different ones. And maybe the tracking provider is completely optional and just no ops, kind of like if you have no flag provider. But we'd have to think about that a little bit more. I totally agree that open telemetry could be a great solution for this, but I would even want that to be pluggable and optional, so that you could plug in open telemetry events if you wanted to, or segment or whatever. But again, the same as Pete, my concern is that this isn't really our wheelhouse, and I don't want to attempt to become like a full featured solution here. So I think we're gonna have to just be careful there. I don't want it to run away from us.
And I think I agree that if I was building an experimentation platform from scratch, I would definitely look at using OpenTelemetry for the analytics part. But if you think about like all of the existing kind of systems that are out there, probably they're not using, like if you like I know that like Split has like a basic analytics capability, and like on the other side, like Optimizely, that's like their bread and butter. If Optimizely was using OpenFeature to do the feature decision, like the should I show A or B part, I don't think you'd be able to, maybe not at all, but or definitely not like easily plug just say like, oh yeah, just emit open telemetry events and Optimizely will pick those up, right? Like it might be that Optimizely or whatever the AB platform is just hasn't got that wiring done. So they would, if I was Optimizely or Split or whatever, I would probably say like, oh well, it would be great if you could just use, like, we have this method that you're supposed to call when a user does A or B, can you just call this function please, rather than like emit an open telemetry event and we'll do a bunch of wiring in our system to pick it up.
Yeah, 100%. I was only saying if you're not already doing like that kind of tracking, you don't have something like Optimize it, then OTel events you might be able to build something simple yourself with OTel events. But yeah, I think that we would basically want to give full flexibility there. So I agree with basically everything that's been said. I think there's a lot of potential value here. We got to be careful, I think, to not to maintain a small scope if we decide to do this, and maybe find some way of defining where the responsibility ends and how far we want to go down that path.
I mean, I think my sense is that you could probably technically do it all with hooks and some plumbing code, and I would almost prefer to wait for like a few people to have done it that way and like see how it is used. And like I think in the JavaScript whatever they're called, the standards committee, I can't remember the name of the TC whatever standards committee, they have this concept of like cow paths, and like looking to see like how like people are naturally using like the ergonomics that they naturally want, and then kind of like finding the cow path and then kind of like turning it into a road or whatever. I kind of feel like we should do the same, and like at least have a few examples of how people are doing this for real before we start kind of trying to define it, particularly because I don't think any of us have like a bunch of background in like analytics, and so I'm sure we would miss some stuff that would be important. And like redoing, like taking an existing spec or implementation, like redoing it would be way harder than waiting a little bit and then trying to get a better sense. I feel like I'm always on these calls, I'm always like saying we should do less. like laziest.
Well, I mean, I think maybe what we could do is kind of do it in sort of in parallel, because the proposal doesn't really hurt, and we can leave it open for quite a while to start gathering feedback and use cases. And I think even Pirate may actually have that use case, honestly, because he's done quite a bit with Postdoc. Like, how do those things wire up? What type of data do you want? I think that'd be quite interesting to capture.
Right. I don't know if you can still hear us, like a little seance here. But like maybe we could try building a version of it just entirely in userland. Okay. I wonder if it's possible to build the whole thing in userland using hooks, and then see, like, get a sense for how it works, right? Like, and I think that would also kind of like pressure test whether there's actually some extra thing that we need to add to the.
I don't think it's a hook, right? So like a hook would like send an event for an evaluation, which you can,
Yeah.
there's a lot of value there, but I think what they'd be looking for like an A/B testing world is like, with this new feature enabled, did it cause new user interaction, someone to
Right.
click a
I guess,
link or
yeah.
whatever, right? So it's
I
like
guess the
they're
way
decoupled.
the way I'm imagining doing it is so let's take the optimizer example. The API that I want to expose, fundamentally the API that I want to expose to a consumer of this experimentation platform, is they need to be able to ask, like, should I show A or B? That's the thing we already do. And they also need to be able to say that this behavior occurred, like this event, like they clicked the button or they didn't click the button, whatever, right? And they need to correlate the two to say, like, the same person that saw this flag evaluation or experienced this flag evaluation also like exhibited this behavior or performed this behavior. So the way that I feel like I would try and build that with OpenFeature is use a hook. So you've got like your analytics system and your feature flag provider, and it's kind of the same. And if every time that you do one of these A/B tests, the hook would fire, and you tell the experimentation platform, in the current context, the current user saw feature A, saw feature A on or off, or whatever, or saw A or B, and then the user, and then just the firing the event that the thing happened or the thing didn't happen would just be entirely outside of OpenFeature, using like the Optimizely SDK, but the Optimizely SDK would be like, oh, okay, this thing happened, and I know from this hook that this user did experience A or did experience B, and then you've kind of like connected the two together.
Just one thing on that. I think post hoc would be dangerous, would be maybe not good, because it's both things together. It kind of avoids a lot of those problems. The one thing that we've experienced, and this is something that we get asked about all the time, and we're going to start working on soon, is everything that Pete said, exactly as that. There's one kind of primitive like method or something that we might need to implement, which is when an anonymous user authenticates. And most analytics platforms have like a primitive mechanism to say, this is an anonymous user, give them a hash and an experiment. This is the user logged in, and consistently maintain those experiments.
Oh yeah.
And that we're at Flagsmith is actually going to build that, because people keep asking us to build it, because you basically, it's very hard not to break either like the experiment effectiveness or the user experience without that. Also most platforms like Amplitude or Mixpanel, they have like that's a core part of their workflow.
Wouldn't that just be like, wouldn't you just do that by having an extra bit of context that's like, like the like user fingerprint or something that is just always kind of.
Yes, the thing is, I think different analytics platforms deal with that problem in different ways, and I think actually like Mixpanel changed the way that they did it a few years ago. So I think the problem is you'd have to delegate how that worked. I think you'd have to delegate that to downstream to the provider. But effectively all it is and let them figure out whether they want to use the anonymously generated GUID or the key or whatever of the authenticated user. But the problem is that I think the thing is you just don't want to get involved in that. But I think it might. I'm worried about too much stuff getting sort of like shoved into the context I don't know. Or also often those identification events are like discrete things that happen. I don't know. I don't know enough about how these. We need someone on from like, you know, yeah, like Mixpanel or Adobe or whatever to say, oh yeah, this is how it works. But I think they generally handle it roughly the same way, but I think they will have different specifics. But if you're going to do analytics, like this is something that we lose customers from, because they're like, well, if you can't do that, we can't use it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think maybe the way forward then is to kind of create that OFAP then, but we'll just keep it in like a draft state to try to gather feedback and use cases and maybe some and then, you know, kind of look for maybe a prototype using as many like existing primitives as possible and see kind of how that flow works. And then, like Pete said, then kind of look for like the cow path, or, you know, seeing what direction people would like to go, how common this is used, how often it's requested, and then figure out, you know, kind of how we can proceed there. Perfect. Sounds good.
Yeah,
I think it's
I think-
very interesting as we get into A/B testing and stuff like that, you know, depending on how aggressively you want to go, but I do think that the feature flags and A/B testing kind of go together quite
I
nicely.
mean, I think it is like, it's basically, yeah, the context and the evaluation results, and that's basically it. But there's definitely like dragons and stuff. It would be great if anyone had contacts at any of the, you know, 10 big analytics firms who could say, you know, that this is how you do it, kind of thing. That would be
I
super
mean, we can
valuable.
go, we could go and talk to vendors that we've talked to before, because all of them do this, like for the exact reason you were just saying, Ben, as a vendor, like, because people, it's like every single customer at some point, well, not every single customer, but like you're always going to get customers that are like, oh, we need to do analytics. And like, just from a business model perspective, they all want to be able to say they do A/B testing, so that, you know, they can get the customer rather than having, you know, optimize to do it with. So anyway, I think like if we went and talked to folks at Launch Darkly or Split or whatever, I think we could get some background, but maybe it would be better to kind of
It's tricky as well, because you can generally like split, you know, there's the providers that do analytics, and then there's the providers that don't, and we like explicitly don't, like, as a decision. But I think, you know, even if you're using Launch Darkly, you still might, you know, there's probably a large proportion of their customers that aren't using their analytics platform, but are using like Adobe or whatever.
Segment or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
Well, that's where I think the real value could be, honestly, if you do it, because then it's like, in your case, if you have a Flagsmith provider, you could register, you know, one or maybe multiple like event trackers or something that it could fire out like automatically, which would be quite cool. And maybe you could extend it to multiple. It could be like, it could, if you're using Launch Darkly or whatever, it could go to there and to say, like, you know, because you could just register multiple event providers or whatever, or tracking providers or whatever we want to go with. Could be quite cool. Have to think about it. Okay.
Good discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, if there's nothing else, I'll post the thing one more time, but yeah, it sounds like we have a plan to kind of go forward to prototype that and kind of keep tracking it. I think this one will take a little while, honestly. It's a pretty major topic that will require a lot of thought, but I think it's good to kind of get the ball rolling on it.
It's like the last part of OpenFeature, I feel like it's the last big piece, to be honest.
I would agree. Yeah. Cool.
Okay, I guess if there's nothing else, we can call it.
Can I ask, can I go back to the React SDK thing, and if we've got time? So
yeah, sure.
I replied to that issue, and like we had some conversations about it. I have my little kind of like prototype implementation. Is there any reason we couldn't just take it and use it? I guess, like, let me rephrase that. What I'm trying to figure out, what's the next step to kind of like to move it along, besides, like, it feels like there's a few things that we're kind of like talking about making a decision on, like, should we do we need to support kind of server-side rendering? Do we need to support like, do we want to use like suspense? So it's like a few things that where like I think we just need to make a decision one way or another, and I'm trying to figure out what's the how much do we let it bake before we just say like, okay, let's make a decision.
Personally, that's kind of why I was proposing, like, I'm happy just to make a stub package. And we can even avoid publishing it until we have some kind of agreement, but I'm happy to, like, you know, do the groundwork in whatever repo it fits in best, and then we can start. Like, I'd be fine, Pete, if you want to just dump your POC in there, and I mean, if everybody looks at it and we agree it's like in the right direction, we can tweak it. If everybody agrees it needs to be totally changed, then we can totally change it. And I mean,
Yeah.
like, I feel like it like putting something concrete there is it probably the best way to get going. So unless there's like opposition to that, that's what I would propose.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Get the ball rolling. It's, you know, once you have something that people can comment and tweak, it's way easier than a bunch of theoretical or just text on a, you know, a markdown or something.
Yeah.
That's a good. I personally think the SDK repo makes the most sense, because if I was going to look for like an SDK, that's where I would look. So I think it's worth the effort of seeing if we can get it working. But I'd be curious on people's thoughts there. Like, it probably doesn't really matter, but
Right. I mean, I think
I'll
people
move
just
the
look
issue.
people look in NPM. They're not going to look in. They're going to look for the module in NPM. They're not going to. I if it was me, I wouldn't start looking in GitHub repos. I'd start with like looking in the OpenFeature namespace.
that's fair. Yeah, I guess and at that point it doesn't really matter. So okay.
Yeah, I think, like, if all things are equal, I would rather see it in the SDK repo. But if it is harder to implement there, then I'll probably put it in contrib. So I'll put it. Go ahead, Pete.
The only I don't have a strong opinion either. The only like little thing that I can think of is like for that POC that I have, there's like one or two extra like little like packages or providers that I created for testing purposes. Like there's that chaos provider that just kind of like lets you simulate kind of like the you know the thing not returning values yet, or you know the provider not being ready, or the provider throwing an error. We would probably want that to be like, it seems like it would be nice to also just kind of create that as just a general purpose thing that's available for testing, and I would probably put that in the contribs. Rob, I don't think
Okay.
that makes sense to put, but like, to be honest, I'm terrible at organizing code, and I always just say like put it all in one place. But I don't. My sense is that we wouldn't want to put that chaos provider in JS SDK. We'd probably want it to stay in contrib land, I would guess.
Yeah. We can pull that apart too, and like I said, I think maybe we'll start by not publishing anything. I'll just get like a working like bed to do some development, and we can start publishing once we kind of think that there's something reasonable, and we'll publish it as alpha. But I guess that's what I'll do next. So I'll take that takeaway, and then I'll let you know when I have like something ready that you can dump code into, Pete, if you want to do that, and then we can go from there.
Or vice versa. If you want to just take it and once you've got something ready, that's fine with me. I mean, I'm very happy for my code to be used for sure.
Yeah, okay. Then just ping me your repo so I make sure I get the right one. Like, you can ping it to me on Slack, and then I'll like maybe.
Yeah, I linked it in the issue, but I'll ping it to you.
Oh, okay.
I'll send you a Slack message.
That's fine. I'll find it in the issue either way. So that'll be my takeaway.
One thing that Pete just reminded me of that I'll mention is we did decide to create like in-memory providers in each SDK. So I'm in the process of doing that for JavaScript as well, just for like easier end-to-end tests. It's also easier in that like getting started section of the README. So basically, I'm kind of porting over what you've done. I'm also kind of conforming to like what some of the other SDKs have done already. And so I'll link that back to the PR that you had opened, but then I think we're sort of, we could probably even look at potentially deprecating that in-memory one.
Yeah, I think there's wait, was that the right? Sorry, I was trying to figure out if I was sharing the right thing. what's there today in that like POC is using, I think this is wrong. Like, I'd have to double check, but I think it's using, I don't think this, I think we ended up taking this and putting it into the SDK. This is the in-memory provider thing.
There's
So
one
it-
in contribs right now, but we're gonna move it like officially into the SDK.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, I'd have to look around and see like how it's used. Yeah, I guess it's not. I guess we'd want to change this because it is using like the version, like the original version, because it's like it's based off of some like a very old proof of concept that I did for a React hook like way back before we had the web SDK, and I just updated it. So this would need to change to whatever is the now the official like in memory
Mhm.
provider.
Yep, that sounds good. Cool. I'll have more details on that soon too. Hopefully I can get to it. All right. Cool. Yeah. It looks like we're basically through the list. Does anyone else have any last thoughts? Yes? No? Okay. Thomas.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah, cool. So just an FYI, there's a wellness day at Dynatrace tomorrow. So Todd and I will be out of the office, but we'll be back actually Kevin you too. So if you need us, you may have to wait till Monday or this weekend. We'll see how it goes. So all right. Cool. Thanks everyone.
See you guys.
Talk to you later.
Thanks.
Bye.